Biodiversity is the richness and the beauty of the world and the ecosystem balancing itself in the environment where everything is it's basically it's like a dance. It's a collaboration of different species, in one sense feeding on each other, but in another sense collaborating to create the balance, which is our beautiful Earth.
I think about usually charismatic megafauna or large romanticized wild animals or complex ecosystems like old growth rainforests. But also, more and more so, I think about the birds at my bird feeder, or of course the pathogens that we live with. All these different components are parts of the range of life that make up biodiversity.
I think of biodiversity, I think of diversity of life on Earth. And so that includes everything, all the species that we're familiar with, all the species we're unfamiliar with, as well as all of the ecosystem services that come along with those species that we might be unsure of the connection of. So things like the bugs, like the bees, that's an example that we hear a lot, is that if we don't have bees in our life, we're not going to have pollination, and that means we're not going to have fresh fruit and all of the things that we have readily available to us all the time. And so that's an example of how one species, if gone, can create a huge impact in our daily lives. And with bees being a huge example, that is also reoccurring in all different kinds of other species. And becoming aware of that and coming to terms with that is something that's important to keep, living the life that we live.
I think first and foremost, biodiversity to me really relates to the richness of the ecosystems. And living in a coastal ecosystem, it is particularly important because over the last period, number of years, but it's an accelerating problem, we've seen a decrease in biodiversity along the west coast for organisms both that are in the water and along the coastal wetlands and those habitats as well. It's one of those impacts that is most clear because you can really just witness the decrease in the number of species and the number of individuals within the species that you would be witnessing on a day-to-day, whether it's off the ferry on the way to Vancouver Island, or whether it's sort of going for a walk in Stanley Park or somewhere right in the city. You can start to see those impacts. I've been very fortunate to spend a lot of time doing outdoor activities, going fishing and spending time on the West Coast and the Gulf Islands, and that's actually, to me, one of the impacts of climate change that has really hit home the most, because it's sort of a direct impact on the beauty of the ecosystems that I've been fortunate to witness and enjoy. I think biodiversity comes up most often for me in the context of one of those discrete impacts of climate change, just through the lens of environmental litigation too. It's quite often cited as one of the detrimental impacts, the impact on biodiversity, which is commonly raised as a result of certain unsustainable practices, whether it's oil spills or rising temperatures causing bleaching of certain organisms in the coastal habitats. And so that's generally where biodiversity comes up most for me. I think that it's, in that context, it's a powerful player in that whole discussion because, as I was saying, it's one of those more concrete and observable impacts of climate change to date that really sort of lends weight to the arguments that people are making to prompt swifter and more significant action.
Well, last time I used the word biodiversity, it was very much to do with the project that I'm involved with. which is to bring aquaponics to the world, basically, and change the way the food is produced, so that food can be produced indoors on about 10% of the standard agricultural footprint, so that a lot of agricultural land can be returned back to the biodiversity it used to support.
I actually was teaching a class on biodiversity recently, and it was a neat way. So I teach a teacher education course, and we were talking about biodiversity, how to bring biodiversity in classroom, and how do we talk about biodiversity to elementary and secondary school students. And there's so many different ways that we can do it. I think the best way is to just go out in nature. And whenever we do think about biodiversity, I think most people think about nature, and most people think about going out and exploring what kinds of different life forms exist. You pick up a rock in the garden or in a forest, and there are millions of different species underneath it, depending on where you pick it up. So that's what I think about. I think about nature. I think about being outdoors and exploring nature when you think about biodiversity.
It's probably in one of the courses that I'm teaching right now, talking about the importance of biodiversity. So lecturing a little bit about why it's important, how it can perhaps be valued, or how society has valued it, and why it's important to think about those things.
I would say it's the variety and diversity of life on Earth.
Biodiversity really refers to biological diversity, or the range of life on Earth, from species to down to different genetic diversity. So really, it represents a huge way of thinking about how much life in all its different forms differ on our planet.
The interaction of different species, different trophic levels, with species feeding on lower trophic levels, and maintaining a balance between all living organisms.
I think I'd use the word variety. It's the variety of life that exists on this planet that has come about through evolution, that has produced the millions of different types of organisms that we see around us, from snails to the tallest redwood tree that you can see.
I think when you think about marine life, first of all, shifting to a more plant-based diet really helps the biodiversity of our oceans, and then it sort of builds from there, because really all the biodiversity in our planet is somewhat dependent on our oceans and our marine life. So I think that's really important. As well, when you eat more plant-based, the meat industry and dairy industry take up so much land, and it just takes away from the biodiversity that's already on our planet.
That's another question, very much like the question of how can we deal with the issue of climate change. And the answer is one that requires organizations, governments, to act in ways that will reshape systemic kinds of problems. The way that we conduct agriculture right now needs to really change, because it's responsible for huge amounts of pesticides, fertilizers that are leading to dead zones in water bodies, as well as just removing, huge swaths of the landscape and converting them to monocultures. So there are ways to change that, but it requires a system shift, a shift towards more sustainable practices in agriculture, in this example, that are more regenerative and are not as harmful for the suite of species in that particular system. So I think systemic changes need to be made to protect biodiversity right now. And we need to think very carefully about how we plan cities and how we plan natural areas. We also need to consider that Indigenous peoples have been thinking about this issue and acting on it, and have retained some of the knowledge about how to deal with biodiversity, a recent study that showed that Indigenous peoples in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand were protecting areas that had higher biodiversity even than national parks in Canada. So we need to listen to that sort of knowledge of the land and the landscape, and we need to think very carefully about the kinds of practices that mainstream sort of Western society has embedded into everyday life.
So the best way to, I think, we can ensure the protection of species is by decreasing human impact on the environment, and whether that's on land, in forests, in the ocean, anywhere we can basically retreat from and let the environment do its thing, if you want to, for lack of a better word, is the best way to go forward. If we just, the world or the earth has a wonderful ability to heal itself. We've done damage extensively, primarily through agriculture. And the more we can retreat from our agriculture, from our fossil fuel extraction activities, fishing, overfishing of the oceans. Basically, if we just leave nature alone, it will heal itself. It will reestablish the balances that were there in the first place, and we'll all be better for it.
So two of the biggest threats to species and ecosystems and biodiversity is land use change and invasive species. So in terms of land use change, this can mean any sort of change to an original ecosystem. So for example, transitioning a forest ecosystem into an agricultural landscape, or turning an existing area into an industrial center. So anything that kind of threatens the original habitats and can contribute to habitat destruction is going to have an impact on the species who rely on the processes that are happening in that area. So a way that we can combat this is to definitely increase conservation efforts. And so that means keeping the areas that are already functioning and keeping them in that same state, and making sure that there's no interference from human activities in those areas, as well as encouraging habitat restoration. So that's making sure that we are taking some of those impacted landscapes that we have altered in some way and trying to bring them back to an original state, or a state that at least can harbor these species that need the habitat and the processes there. In terms of invasive species, this is something that is, of course, a human-dominated impact, because we have brought so many species across the world and taken them out of their ecological niches and put them into new areas that they're not supposed to be in, and that can cause cascading effects for all of the native species in that area. So trying to not only reduce that spread, which is a difficult thing to do considering how globalized our world is, but also trying to combat the species that we have already introduced to new areas. So this is it's a hard thing to do, and it's very expensive, but trying to reduce the ecological toll that these invasive species have on our native ecosystems is really important to conserve biodiversity in our world.
My hope is that we will increase biodiversity and that we will enhance our ecosystems and our nature so that we can exist on this earth in harmony with other species and other life and non-life forms. So my hope is that we will work towards that as a global community. And I think that's happening. A lot of changes have happened, especially in the past 5 years. A lot of people have learned about climate change. They are on board that, climate change is happening because of human causes. So we are on the right path. We just need to move a little faster.
My hope for the state of biodiversity in the future is that we recognize the effect that humans have had and continue to have on the environment, both on land and in the ocean. and in the atmosphere. And just recognizing that whenever humans have an impact, which is disproportionate to their requirements for survival, usually that impact is a negative one. So if we can withdraw, if we can produce our essentials, which are primarily food, on land, with having a decreased environmental impact, and we can do that now with the advent of vertical farms. We can produce our own food on much less land than has traditionally been done. So as long as we continue moving away from treating the earth as if it's our dominion and ours to do with what we will, if we can have this mindset change of having reverence for the planet, having reverence for the environment. I think we can definitely change the way we've perceived ourselves, and decrease the impact that we've continuously had over the centuries, and move towards a more sustainable future.
So right now, some people would say that we are experiencing a sixth mass extinction, which kind of falls into the idea that we have gone through 5 previous mass extinctions over the history of life on Earth, and the rate at which we are experiencing species extinction falls under similar rates that would characterize it as a mass extinction. So what I would hope is that we could find a way to reduce the extinction rate that we are currently experiencing and that we have a huge hand in creating. The background extinction rate is so much smaller than what we are creating or what we are influencing it to be today. And it would just be so nice to kind of come out of that and to get species back on track so that they are healthy and ecosystems are more fruitful, and all of these different life processes are healthy and aren't experiencing just such an extreme rate of mass extinction moving forward.